The smoke was visible from a quarter-mile away, not the thin gray thread of a chimney or a burn barrel, but the thick, rolling black that means something structural is feeding a fire that has already made up its mind. Gunnery Sergeant Reed Calloway saw it the moment he crested the hill on Route 12 outside Blairsville, Georgia, and his foot was already moving from the accelerator to the brake before the conscious part of his brain had caught up with what his eyes had already processed. Beside him, Diesel was standing. Not sitting, not alerting, standing, all 4 feet on the seat, pressed against the windshield with his nose at the glass and his body rigid with the particular tension that Reed had learned in 6 years of working beside him was not fear, but the opposite of fear. The forward-leaning, muscle-locked readiness of a dog that has already made its decision and is waiting for the man to make his. The woman was in the road. She was in the road on her knees, and her mouth was open, and the sound coming from her was the sound that human beings make when language stops being adequate. Reed had heard that sound once before, in Fallujah, and he had sworn then and he swore now that he would never be the person who drove past it. He was already pulling onto the shoulder. Diesel was already at the door. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end, because what happened in the next 4 minutes on Route 12 outside Blairsville, Georgia will stay with you long after this video ends. We read every single comment. We want to know how far this story travels. Reed Calloway was 41 years old, built the way men build when they have been operating in conditions that favor endurance over spectacle. Lean and long-limbed and carrying the kind of physical capability that registered not as size but as economy. The quality of a man whose body had learned to do a great deal with whatever it had available. He was 6 feet and 1 inch, with dark reddish-brown hair cut close, and a face that had the particular lean angularity of someone who spent time outdoors and squinted into the sun and didn't think about it. His jaw was clean-shaved, and his nose had been broken once, in a hand-to-hand training accident at Camp Lejeune in 2010, and had healed with a slight rightward deviation that was visible only in certain lights, and that his sister had once described, charitably, as character. His eyes were the feature people remembered, a deep, unwavering brown, the color of creek-bottom stone in clear water, that moved through the world with the unhurried, comprehensive attention of someone who had long since stopped seeing looking and being ready as separate activities. He was not an alarming person to meet. He was the kind of man you felt better standing near without immediately understanding why. He had done 4 deployments with the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, Ramadi in 2007, Helmand Province in 2010, the Sangin District in 2012, and a 4th rotation through Kandahar in 2015 that he had completed with a Silver Star and a shrapnel wound to the left forearm that had required 2 surgeries and left a ropey scar from the wrist to the elbow that he wore without self-consciousness because he had long since stopped keeping track of which parts of himself the years had marked. He had separated in 2018 at the end of his final enlistment. The decision made not from exhaustion, but from the arithmetic of what he had, and what the continued commitment would cost, and the honest conclusion that both could be better spent in different ways. He had come to Blairsville because a man he had deployed with 3 times had been born there, and had described it, once, as the last place in Georgia where the mountains still looked the way mountains were supposed to look. The man was not alive to know that Reed had taken his advice. Reed had come anyway, 2 years ago, and had found that the man had been exactly right, and had stayed. Diesel was a 6-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of rich mahogany layered over deep black, an unusual coloring in the breed, warmer toned than standard, that made him look in certain lights like something forged rather than born. He weighed 88 pounds and moved with a low, purposeful intensity that people who knew working dogs recognized immediately, and people who didn't described, uniformly, as something they hadn't seen before in a dog. His right ear carried a notch at the base, where a fragment had clipped it during a building clearance in Kandahar in 2015, the same operation that had given Reed his scar, which Reed had always considered a form of parallel accounting between them. He navigated the world through scent and sound and a constant overlapping cycle of environmental assessment that produced conclusions faster than Reed could consciously process, and Reed had learned, over 6 years of working together and 2 years of living together, that the conclusions were reliable. The military working dog adoption process had taken 7 months, 3 formal appeals, and 1 call to a senator's office. Reed had not considered this excessive. Some things were simply worth the effort they cost. Union County in October smelled of wood smoke and dead leaves and the high, thin sweetness of Blue Ridge mountain air at the moment the season turns. The particular combination of cold and color that people drove 4 hours from Atlanta to experience, and that Reed drove through every morning to get groceries. The mountains to the north held the last of the fall color, and the sky above them was the deep, clear blue of a cold front that had pushed through overnight and left the air washed and precise. Route 12 ran east out of Blairsville through a valley where the older properties sat on deep lots behind old trees, and the house at the Caldwell address, a white frame farmhouse with a covered porch and a red barn set back from the road, was set back far enough that the fire had been burning for several minutes before it was visible from the road, and was now visible to anyone on Route 12 for half a mile in either direction. The woman in the road was named June Caldwell. She was 71 years old and had been born in Union County and had not lived more than 12 miles from the place she was born in any of those 71 years, which was not a constriction, but a choice. A life built intentionally in a specific place among specific people, in the way that lives are built when the people doing the building are serious about what they are making. Her husband was Harold. Harold was 74, a retired county road supervisor, a deacon at the First Baptist Church on Pine Street, a man who had grown up on this property and whose father had built the farmhouse in 1951, and whose name was in the concrete of the front step, where it had been pressed there with a stick in 1951 when the concrete was wet, and Harold had been 4 years old, and his father had said, "Do it, it will last." And it had. Harold was in the farmhouse. He had gone in to get the dog, their dog, a 12-year-old beagle named Pip, when the fire started in the kitchen wall, and he had not come back out, and June had been in the road for 4 minutes when Reed's truck came over the hill. Reed did not make a plan. He had learned, in the kind of environments where improvisation had permanent consequences, that the moment you spend on a plan you don't need is a moment you don't have for the thing you do. He assessed the structure in the 4 seconds it took to cross the yard. Single story. Wood frame. The fire was in the rear left, the kitchen. And working forward along the left wall. The front door was center right. He had time. He was not certain he had much more than time, but he had it. He told June to stay in the road. She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who is beyond the reach of instructions, but who heard him, and nodded because nodding was still possible. Diesel pressed against her left leg for 1 second, 1 deliberate second of contact, and then turned and followed Reed toward the house. The front door was unlocked. The hallway was clear, smoke moving low and fast along the left side. Reed went in calling Harold's name. Diesel went left toward the smoke, then stopped. Reversed, he was not going toward the fire. He was moving toward something else, pulling right toward what Reed registered as the back hallway, away from the kitchen. Reed followed the dog. He found Harold in the bathroom off the back bedroom, on the floor, conscious but disoriented, with a 12-year-old beagle pressed against his chest and the door pulled mostly shut against the smoke. Harold had made it this far, and then the smoke had taken his legs, and he had gone down and pulled the door and stayed low the way people know to stay when they know anything about fires, and Pip had not left him. Which was the only reason Harold's face was pressed into the dog's fur instead of the floor. Diesel went flat beside Harold. Barrier posture present, Reed got Harold's arm over his shoulder and got him upright, and Harold's legs worked enough to matter, and they moved through the back hallway and through the side door that opened onto the yard and into the October air, and Harold was coughing and shaking, and Pip was in his arms, and June was across the yard in the time it took Reed to register that she had not stayed in the road, and it did not matter because she was here and Harold was here, and the fire could have the kitchen and the left wall and whatever else it wanted. Harold sat on the grass with his back against the old oak at the property line, and June sat beside him, and Pip sat in Harold's lap and did not move, and Diesel walked a perimeter of the three of them. A slow, deliberate circuit, close enough to touch but not touching, checking the air, checking the yard, checking Harold's breathing and June's hands, and the specific quality of the silence after the immediate crisis, which is a different quality than any other kind of silence, and which Diesel had encountered before, and which he treated with the same calm, systematic attention he gave to everything. The fire department arrived 9 minutes later. The structure loss was the kitchen and the left rear of the house. Significant, repairable, the farmhouse itself stood. Harold's name was still in the front step concrete. What came after the fire was where the second story began, and it was Diesel who found it first. 3 days after the fire, while Harold was staying with his daughter in Blairsville, and the house was being assessed by an insurance adjuster named Wade Tipton, Diesel walked the property with Reed during a site check and stopped at the barn. Not at the barn door, at the side of the barn, where a recent vehicle track was still visible in the mud from the rain that had followed the fire. He stood at the track with his nose working in the specific, methodical way he worked when scent was layered. Old information under new, a sequence rather than a single event. And his ears were up, and his body was angled toward the structure, and he made the low sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a whine, and that Reed had come to understand as the sound Diesel made when what he had found required human processing before canine action. Reed looked at the track. He looked at the barn. He looked at the insurance adjuster's vehicle in the driveway, and at the notes Wade Tipton was making on his clipboard, and at the way Tipton had been photographing the kitchen damage from angles that seemed, to someone who had spent years learning to notice what people photographed and what they didn't, more interested in documentation than investigation. He made one call that evening. The call was to a woman named Lila Marsh at the Georgia Department of Insurance, who covered the North Georgia District, and whose number Reed had gotten from a Union County Sheriff's deputy he had worked a community security event with the previous spring. He gave Lila the adjuster's name, the claim number, and the specific sequence of what Diesel had found. Lila asked him to text her the photograph of the vehicle track. He did. What Lila Marsh found when she pulled Wade Tipton's file took her less than an hour. Tipton had been flagged in 2 previous claim adjustments in Lumpkin and Gilmer counties, both rural properties, both elderly homeowners, both claims that had been initially assessed at substantially below replacement cost before the homeowners had engaged attorneys and the assessments had been revised. In one case, the original assessment had been 42% of the replacement value. In the second, 38%. In both cases, Tipton had submitted his assessment and closed the file before the homeowners had received independent appraisals. And in one case, the homeowner, an 82-year-old widower, had accepted Tipton's number and signed the settlement and lost $18,000 to the Gap. Tipton worked for a third-party adjusting firm retained by 3 insurance carriers in North Georgia. The firm had been the subject of an informal complaint to the Department of Insurance 14 months earlier that had not been formally investigated because the complaint had come from a homeowner without legal representation and had been submitted on the wrong form. Reed drove to Harold's daughter's house the following morning and sat at the kitchen table with Harold and June and told them what he had found and what Leila Marsh had started. He told them not to sign anything. He told them that an independent licensed appraiser named Carol Fenn, a woman Leila Marsh had recommended, who had testified in 2 previous insurance fraud cases in North Georgia, would be at the property on Friday, and that everything after that would go through Carol and Lila and a copy of the file that Lila had already sent to the State Insurance Commissioner's office. June looked at him across the table for a moment. "Why are you doing all this?" she said. Reed thought about it. "Harold went back in for a 12-year-old beagle," he said. "That kind of person deserves someone who goes back in for them." Harold looked down at Pip in his lap. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on the old dog's head. Diesel, who had been lying beside Reed's chair, stood up and walked around the table and sat down beside Harold's left knee. He did not press. He simply sat, present and specific, his amber eyes open and his ears tracking the room, in the posture of a dog that has decided to make itself available without asking anything in return. Wade Tipton's preliminary assessment of the Caldwell claim came in at 61% of the independent appraisal Carol Fenn submitted the following week. The gap was $37,000. The Georgia Department of Insurance opened a formal investigation of Tipton's adjusting firm 12 days after Leila Marsh's referral. The investigation expanded to include a review of 14 claims in 5 North Georgia counties over 3 years, and ultimately found a systematic pattern of low-ball initial assessments on rural properties with elderly homeowners who were unlikely to seek independent review. The firm's contract with 2 of the 3 insurance carriers was terminated during the investigation. Tipton's adjuster license was suspended pending the outcome of a criminal referral to the Gilmer County District Attorney's Office for insurance fraud. The Caldwell claim was settled at full replacement value. The kitchen, the left wall, the flooring, and the electrical that the fire inspector determined had been the origin point and that had been in the house since 1978 and overdue for replacement by 12 years. Harold's daughter organized a work party of 14 people from the First Baptist congregation on a Saturday in November, and the kitchen framing went up in one day, and Harold was back in the farmhouse by Christmas with new wiring and a better stove, and his name still in the front step concrete, exactly where his father had told him to put it. 4 months after the October morning on Route 12, Reed Calloway sat in one of the 2 porch chairs at the Caldwell farmhouse on a Sunday in February with a cup of coffee and the particular quiet of a North Georgia morning when the temperature is in the low 30s and the mountains are clear and the smoke from the chimney goes straight up because there is no wind. Harold was in the other chair. Pip was on Harold's lap, which was where Pip had been most of every day since the fire, because dogs who have been through something with someone tend to stay close after, which is not anxiety, but accuracy, an honest accounting of what matters. Diesel lay on the porch boards between the 2 chairs with his chin on the painted wood and his eyes moving in the slow, satisfied sweep of a dog that has done what he came to do and is content to be still. The kitchen smelled of coffee and new wood, and the particular cleanness of a house that has been rebuilt. Harold's name was in the concrete step below them, and his father's hands were in the barn across the yard, and the mountains to the north were the color of cold iron in the February light. And there was, on this porch, on this morning, the particular piece of things that have been tested and held. Reed had not planned to be here. He had been driving to get motor oil. He had learned, in 2 years of living in these mountains after 18 years of being somewhere else, that the most important things he had done in his life had begun that way, not with a plan, but with a dog who stood up and pressed his nose to the glass, and a man who had learned, across more difficult classrooms than most people encounter, that the dog was usually right. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they come over a hill on a county road in October, and a dog is already standing before the truck is stopped, and a man gets out without hesitating, because he was trained not to hesitate and has never found a reason to unlearn it. God does not always send rescue before the damage is done. Sometimes he sends it after, to stand at the barn wall and find what the fire left behind, to sit at the kitchen table and say don't sign anything, to make sure that the person who went back in for a 12-year-old beagle does not come out to find that they have lost everything twice. Courage is not only what happens in the 4 minutes before the fire department arrives. Sometimes it is what happens in the 4 days after, when the crisis is technically over and the paperwork begins, and the person who was in the road on their knees is now at a kitchen table being told what they are owed, and who is fighting to make sure they receive it. That is the less visible courage. It is no less necessary. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the person who showed up is not always the one in the photograph. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if someone has ever come over a hill at exactly the moment you needed them to, or if you have ever been the one who stopped without knowing fully why. We would like to hear that. Your story may reach someone today who needs to know that stopping is still something people do. If you believe in stories of service, loyalty, and the courage that keeps going after the fire is out, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and grant you the courage to stop on the hill. Because somewhere on a road right now, someone needs exactly that.